Hi there. My name is Ed Roberts, and I'm a lecturer in early medieval history at the University of Kent. And what I'm going to be talking about today draws on modules that I teach within the medieval history cluster in the School of History. And this sample lecture concerns one of the great events of history, the fall of the Roman Empire. What happened when the Roman Empire collapsed, and I think the importance of this question really lies in a bigger issue of how we get from an ancient world of an urban society, of city-states, Roman legions, slavery, everything that we think of as part of Roman culture. How do we go from that to something which is more quintessentially medieval, concerning a more rural society of villages and peasants, knights and castles, serfs, and feudalism, and everything that kind of comes with that. So, in understanding how we make that transition is a fundamental question that we need to ask of late ancient and early medieval history. And what I'm going to talk about today concerns one aspect of that, concerning the end of the empire and the transformation of identities in between the 4th and 6th centuries. So the end of the empire has classically been told as a story of barbarian invasion, as illustrated to some extent by the infamous spaghetti map, like one you can see here, where you see lots of different groups such as Vandals, Goths, Franks, and so forth, who all invaded and plundered the Roman Empire, bringing the Roman state to its knees and dismantling the entire thing. Now, historians today are emphasize less this catastrophist position and are more interested in looking at migration to some extent, and seeing not just barbarians as causing the end of the Roman Empire, but a Roman Empire that was already quite weak and struggling structurally with lots of conflicts and internal problems, as sort of the crumbling empire sort of prompting the movements of different peoples, prompting the migration of peoples across the Roman frontiers and into the empire. Now, migration produces new identities, and one of the challenges we have in deciding what actually happened is trying to work out who Romans and barbarians actually were, and how these labels could be understood and indeed could be used by individuals living in this period. So we might think first for a moment about what it meant to be Roman. Well, Romans had a kind of shared understanding of a shared set of concepts and practices about what it meant to be a Roman, and this pertained to being part of a common political and religious community, having certain standards of morality, having a recourse to the Roman law, and generally doing things like your ancestors used to. Romans really privileged what's often known as the mos maiorum, the ways of the elders. And there were certain types of people who typified this Romanitas, Romanness, if you like, such as farmers, soldiers, and citizens. You know, the industrious, hardworking farmer on his rural farm, the soldier kind of valiantly defending the Roman state, the res publica, and everything that came with citizenship, certain political and legal freedoms and status. Now, understanding what a barbarian is much more difficult in some ways, and in terms of trying to decide who the barbarians actually were, because our use of this term has developed somewhat from what this meant in the ancient world. So in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, a barbaros, which was a Greek word which is transferred into Latin, a barbaros is someone who spoke a foreign language, because they sound like bar, 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 bar. It doesn't sound like Greek or Latin. And this term in Roman times comes to refer to someone who simply lives outside the frontiers of the empire, someone who is who's in the barbaricum and is a foreigner, basically. Amongst some of the better known groups within when we think of it as barbarians, we might think of the Huns, the Goths, the Vandals, the Franks, the Angles and Saxons and Jutes, who all came to Britain to some extent. A lot of these terms have obviously passed into modern English in somewhat pejorative ways, and we think of these as kind of in quite negative terms. But it wasn't a barbarian in ancient society did not necessarily have to be construed as something completely negative. Now, these were not sort of single ethnic groups that we're talking about here. These were probably smaller tribes that sometimes coalesced into larger groups, and increasingly so perhaps in the 5th century. And we don't really know what they thought of themselves. Did they think of themselves as Frankish or Gothic, or perhaps more generally German or Germanic? We don't know, because all of the written sources we have are written from the perspective of Romans. What we do know is that Romans had began using barbarian soldiers in the army. And now some have argued that this barbarized army was diluted and weakened, and this is one of the reasons that the empire fell apart. But actually what we know is that a lot of soldiers of barbarian origin actually tended to sort of de-barbarize themselves and Romanize themselves, so to speak. And so you get, from the 4th century, leaders and generals, perhaps most famously Stilicho, as you see here, who was a Vandal, but portrayed himself very much as a Roman, ruled Stilicho was one of the most powerful people in the Western Empire in the late 4th century. And he ruled without issues owing to his barbarian origins. And you can see here the way he's depicted in this ivory diptych was very much, he obviously looks like a Roman to some extent, doesn't he? And what we actually find is that by the 4th and the 5th centuries, being a Roman is not just a matter of being a Roman citizen. Now, there is an idea of Romanness which is tied up with what we might think of as urban culture, civility, civilitas in Latin, which meant adhering to certain ideas about literary education, freedom, living according to the law. But these are largely cultural identities, and a person can be seen as acting like a barbarian or a Roman. And what we find actually is that being called a barbarian is to some extent a rhetorical device which you can use to highlight whether someone is different from you, or alternatively you can describe someone as being a Roman if you being a Roman wanted to highlight that someone was kind of one of you to some extent. And so writers of this period often describe positive qualities of barbarian society purely as a means of criticizing things that were bad about Roman society. And in art too, these depictions could be quite nebulous. Famously, there's a mosaic of a ruler in Ravenna in northern Italy, and there's debate as to whether this represents the Roman Emperor Justinian or the Gothic king Theodoric the Great. So Romanness as an identity was fluid, and we can perhaps see this to some extent by looking briefly at some evidence from a Roman bureaucrat in the 5th century who played with these ideas in his descriptions of powerful individuals. And this man's name was Sidonius Apollinaris. And very briefly, just to kind of highlight a couple of things here, Sidonius is describing a Visigothic king, Theodoric. And actually, Sidonius is trying to, for various reasons, is trying to make Theodoric out to be a pretty good guy. He says he's not so bad. In his physical description, you can see that he's sort of pointing out that he's not some kind of big, hairy, barbarian. He actually is quite well groomed. He has lovely long eyelashes, for instance. He has a finely curved nose. These are not things that would have been associated with the way a barbarian looked to some extent. He's modest. He's not some intemperate kind of angry brute. His dinner table conversation is very much is civilized and sophisticated, and so you get a very positive portrayal. He's royal, but he's also humane. He's not for Sidonius in this text at least. Theodoric is not. He's not such a bad guy. He's like one of us. That's the idea being put across here. And you can contrast this with the way Sidonius wrote a short while later about someone who was a Roman official named Serenatus. And as you can see from Sidonius's language here, he didn't think much to Serenatus, who he considered corrupt and a savage. He refers to him as a Catiline of our day, Catiline being a rebel in the in late Republican Rome. Sidonius describes him as a despot, a tyrant, a barbarian who's illiterate, doesn't know the law, and indeed makes a comparison there between Roman laws and barbarian laws. And so you can kind of get a sense here of how these two things could be deployed, how these contrasting ideas could be used for rhetorical effect, depending on what kind of what kind of point you wanted to prove. And so to close, what I want to sort of stress in this very, very quick tour of identity in the late Roman and early medieval world is to point out a couple of things that identity and ethnicity is not something that is fixed. It can be emphasized and exaggerated for different purposes. Migration and the increasing fusion of these Roman and non-Roman peoples leads to gradually the creation of new identities, which will characterize those of the European Middle Ages. Thanks for listening.